The most important thing that the United States can and should do is bolster its military capabilities to counter China's anti access area denial threats, to be able to have a credible capability to defend Taiwan. And today, China has some conventional military advantages over the United States. And it's going to take time for the United States to build those capabilities. So that's, I think, the most important thing that the United States needs to do. Secondly, I think that the US needs to continue to build coalitions to encourage the international community to take measures to warn China that any use of force, any unilateral change in the status quo would be met with severe consequences. And of course, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is some discussion going on between the United States and its allies as to what sanctions they might be willing to impose on China should it use force against Taiwan. And then there's the question of whether countries will be willing to make a commitment to make those threats public or to convey them credibly to China so that Beijing understands that the costs of using force would be very high.
You talked about coalitions. Have you seen sufficient coalition building with US and its allies in terms of countering China's actions?
The United States is building different coalitions. Of course, there's the Quad, which is not a military organization, but it is a coalition of the willing that I think is in part working together because of shared concerns about the threats that China poses. And of course, that includes Australia, Japan, and India, as well as the United States. The AUKUS arrangement, that includes Australia and the UK and the United States, is not just aimed at the longer term goal of building nuclear powered submarines for Australia, but really to share technologies and military technologies in particular. And that AUKUS may interact with other countries as well, such as Japan. And then, of course, there's the EU, which is working very closely, I think, with the United States, exploring what kind of consequences could be imposed on China. There's a growing recognition in Europe that even though the Taiwan Strait is very far away, that any conflict in that region would have profoundly negative consequences for the global economy, and that the costs for Europe would be even higher than the costs they are incurring from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
When you talked about Europe, we've seen countries such as Lithuania that have been taking the lash from China in terms of cooperating with Taiwan. Do you see more countries standing up in part of this coalition with the US?
Every country that is concerned about Taiwan's security and willing to strengthen deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. Every country has just a different level of sort of comfort, what they're willing to do for Taiwan. So some countries are their parliaments are sending delegations to Taiwan. Others are sending officials. Some countries will send officials publicly and declare that they're going to Taiwan. Others do so quietly. So the comfort level just varies from one country to the next. There are very few countries today that are willing to sign trade agreements with Taiwan. I think that's something that needs fixing. This includes the United States. We are now, of course, negotiating a possible trade agreement through the 21st Century Initiative on US-Taiwan trade. And that perhaps could provide some incentive for other countries to do the same. But I think the economic pillar is fairly weak so far. But you have countries just doing different things with Taiwan. Where in Europe, of course, you have Lithuania and the Czech Republic, really at one end of the spectrum, really in the lead, doing probably the most with Taiwan. The EU as an organization, of course, having talks with Taiwan. And the UK recently sending a senior official to Taiwan as well. So it varies from country to country, but the trends are really quite clear. I think almost all US allies are, because they have more concern about Taiwan's security, are more willing than in the past, at least rhetorically, to speak out about the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
You mentioned 21st century trade, and now that there seems to be a waning of the red wave and the Democrats seem to have a bit more of a mandate, do you feel that trade negotiations between Taiwan and the US could go a step further?
Well, I recently testified before the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives, and it's quite clear that there is a wellspring of support for Taiwan and for negotiating trade agreements with Taiwan. There are some concerns, of course, that persist about some agricultural issues, also about Taiwan's labor laws. But there is a interest in these negotiations. So the question is going forward, how much pressure is Congress going to put on the Biden administration? And is there a possibility that a 21st century initiative trade agreement can be taken to the next level to really be a bilateral trade agreement that includes market access? Because this current agreement is really on the trade side about trade facilitation. It actually mirrors the the components in the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has a series of, I think it's 11 working groups. So the plan right now is in the talks with Taiwan to make progress on 4 out of these 11 issues this year, and then hopefully to resolve any outstanding problems and finish the remaining 7 next year. But it is a different question as to whether or not the United States would negotiate a more traditional agreement that includes market access. And that's going to be, in large part, a political question. The Biden administration has really not supported market access. It has been emphasizing a foreign policy and trade agreements that serve the interests of the middle class and workers in America. So it's going to be a tough challenge, but I don't rule it out. And I think the Republicans are likely to have a few more seats than the Democrats, and they will have I think, an aggressive pro-Taiwan agenda.
Going back to the elephant in the room, um, what do you feel is Xi's agenda in terms of invading Taiwan?
In terms of the real likelihood, my own analysis is that Xi Jinping understands that there are potentially very high costs in invading Taiwan. First of all, if the PLA launches a full-scale invasion and it fails and suffers great losses, that could really harm the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping's own position. So I think that this is not a decision he is going to make very easily. That said, if Xi Jinping were to believe that there was a serious possibility that Taiwan could become a de jure independent country that would be recognized by the United States and other countries, then I believe that even if he believed that if Taiwan were to be attacked and the Chinese might fail, the PLA might not succeed, he would still take that risk because he would want to be seen as defending that what they claim is the territorial integrity and sovereignty of their country. So 2027 is a date that has been kicked around quite a bit. It does represent a goal for the development of military capabilities. We know that. Xi Jinping referred to 2027 in his political report to the 20th Party Congress. And of course, it is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA. That said, that date cannot be tied, at least through any authoritative document that I have seen, with a decision to use force against Taiwan. So I believe that Xi Jinping has not yet made a decision to use force. What he has said at the 19th Party Congress and then repeated at the recent 20th Party Congress is that reunification is an inevitable requirement for national rejuvenation. This is not necessarily a deadline. 2049, the target date for national rejuvenation, in that year, Xi Jinping would be 95 years old. The odds are against him still being in power at that time. And so that suggests that it may not be a legacy issue for him in his own term in office, that he may kick that can down the road. But that will depend on the policies of Taiwan and the United States, whether he sees time as on his side, whether he sees peaceful unification as ever possible. So there are a lot of variables. And so I think we have to continue to prepare as if that invasion could take place tomorrow.